In this video, we want to talk about global business, and in particular, we want to look at the influences of several factors on the competitiveness of global business. We want to see what is it that makes companies competitive and successful in the global market. So we start with international competitiveness. Well, international competitiveness, this refers to the ability of a country, or indeed a company, to provide goods and services which are better value than their overseas rivals. So quite simply, international competitiveness means that companies are able to beat rivals in other countries. Companies who make essentially the same products or offer the same services in other countries, they are going to have problems in competing with the domestic producer. So it could be, for example, in the UK, a company is very good at producing some particular engineering component, and it means that rivals right across the world find it difficult to compete with the company because of its ability to produce cheaply, high quality, has a good reputation, and it's innovative. So international competitiveness catches up or brings to the fore many aspects we associate with good management and with long-term growth prospects. So we're really here talking about competitive advantage. In the same way we talk about competitive advantage domestically, we talk about one company having an advantage over another company domestically because of its innovation or its ability to produce high quality goods and so on. So we talk about that domestically, but now we're simply transferring it to the international scene. We're talking about the company being able to beat its rivals domestically and also beat its rivals internationally. And that's what we mean by international competitiveness. As there is a constant threat from foreign competition, it's essential for business to strive to improve competitiveness. So it's not simply good enough to be good in one time period. The company must aim to be good in a continuous sense, in a sense that it's innovating over time. It is producing goods that are required, goods that are high quality, goods that are at the right price. And it's producing these continuously over time. There is a tendency to look to government to play a role in maintaining the competitiveness of companies. However, ultimately this is a matter for companies. It's the companies who determine the design of the product, the attributes of the product, the quality of the product. It's the companies who look to offer good customer satisfaction. The government does have some influence on this, as we'll see later, but ultimately it's the responsibility of the company. Now, let's look at some determinants of international competitiveness. Well, quite simply, it's the price relative to the competitors. It's what a company who's trading internationally, what that company can offer in terms of design, in terms of quality, and the price at which it's offering it. And then look at what the competitors are doing overseas. So it's price relative to competitors. And if we were making similar products, if the products were identical indeed, then the price would be a major determining factor. The productivity is also important. Productivity is difficult to measure because, as we've seen in other videos, do we talk about the productivity of a machine or the productivity of the worker? Workers and machines sometimes work together. So if the machine is developed perhaps new components added to the machine or new software added to the machine may become more productive. That doesn't mean the workers become more productive. The machine has become more productive. So in looking at productivity, it's particularly tricky. It's complicated. And we have to treat productivity measurements with a lot of care. But as I said, that is the subject matter of other videos on the course. Unit costs are important. It's not just the price that the competitors charge and what the domestic producer can offer its products for, but it's the costs. We know, for example, in the UK, production in the southeast around London area is more expensive. Property values are far higher. Depends on where the company is located, but generally speaking. So a company setting up in, say, the remote parts of Wales or Scotland may have lower unit costs. On the other hand, they may have higher transport cost. And there may be problems about acquiring the right types of labour and so on. So looking at unit costs are important because it's costs in relationship to price and hence revenue which determine profits. And it's profits that determines whether the business will exist or not. The state of technology is also important. Some companies keep abreast of what's happening in terms of innovations and current practice. Some companies let it slip. By and large, the companies that keep up to date and ensure that their workers are adequately trained and that the technology they're using and the equipment they're using is up to date, those companies survive, generally speaking. They tend to have lower unit costs, they tend to make a better product. But looking at the state of technology, that is what's happening in the wider world. We know that, for example, in the context of computers and of ICT and computer communication systems and robotics and so on, we know that there have been immense breakthroughs in these areas, and this is likely to continue. And companies that don't embrace this will inevitably have problems. It's necessary for companies to invest in capital and to maintain their capital base and to ensure that it's up to date. So companies should have within their strategic plans provision for capital investment and updating equipment, updating premises, updating the design, and indeed ensuring that their workers are kept up to date through good training practices and good training courses. Quality is also an issue. Quality has come to the fore in probably the last 30 years in a big way, and it was probably the contribution of the Japanese when they started to export on a large scale. But their products were seen as high, very, very good quality, and that woke up producers in Europe and in America and other places to the need to have good quality. Customers expected. Customers are using some of their scarce resources, money that they have to work for. They're using this to acquire the product, and they expect the product to be good quality. So quality is important, as is reliability. The two go together to some extent, but if customers buy a product, they expect it to be able to perform according to what it claims. If the producers say the expected lifespan of this product is a year, they expect it to last a year. They may be pleasantly surprised because it goes on for 2 years. but they will certainly be unhappy if it breaks down after a couple of weeks. So reliability is an issue. It goes with quality, having said that. Lead time. Sometimes orders can become frustrated because producers can't honour what they've said. They said that they will deliver the product within the month, and they can't do it. That will get the company a bad reputation. So it's important, particularly in the context of international competitiveness, that companies are able to meet lead times. It's also complicated because in terms of international competitiveness, lead times mean that shipping can be organised appropriately. Reserving space in a container on the assumption that the lead time will be met can be tricky if the companies are not reliable. It may be that the company will then be contractually bound to pay for the space reserved, and nothing happens. There's nothing in the space. Nothing has been shipped because the company was unable to meet its lead time. So it is important. Entrepreneurship is a topic that was really ignored by a lot of, particularly economists, but management people as well. The literature on entrepreneurship was really kicked off in Austria around the 1870s by some quite obscure economists, now known as Austrian economists. But it wasn't really developed. It wasn't properly understood. It's only in probably the last 20 years, 25 years, that there's been a concerted effort on the part of academics mostly to understand the nature of entrepreneurship. And there's still confusion. Sometimes people mix it up with management. Sometimes people mix up entrepreneurship with good practice. Entrepreneurship is the spark. It's the insight that some people have regarding a product or about a design or about some niche in the market that other people simply can't see, but the entrepreneur can see. So it's like enlightenment that some people have got. These are called the entrepreneurs. Once they've identified the niche in the market, once they've identified the potential for a new product, they then hand it over to management, who develop the product. So the managers implement the ideas of the entrepreneurs. Of course, it may be the case that managers and entrepreneurs are the same people. Managers may have bright ideas as well, and managers may observe niches in markets. So it could be the managers and the entrepreneurs are one and the same people. But we have to distinguish the two functions. Entrepreneurship is spotting the gap in the market. Entrepreneurship is what a famous writer called Israel Kirzner called alertness to opportunities. So entrepreneurship is a person who is alert to opportunities. Having identified the gap, having identified the type of product required, the managers then make it. But clearly, international competitiveness is a function of entrepreneurship. Which countries have got the better entrepreneurs? Which ones are making products that are more attractive, more functional, better designed, better quality? So which countries have a reputation for this? The exchange rate is also important in determining international competitiveness. The exchange rate is simply the amount we get for our own currency, the amount we get in someone else's currency. So if we were in the UK and we were trading with, let's say, China, we want to know the number of yuan we get per pound. If American exporters were dealing with India, they want to know what the rupee dollar exchange rate is. And of course the exchange rates move every day because the exchange rate is simply a reflection of supply and demand for individual currencies. We'll talk about the exchange rate more fully in a separate video, but for the moment, clearly the amount that companies get of foreign currency and their ability to change the foreign currency into the domestic currency so they can pay their costs, pay their workers, pay the bills, and make a profit. That must be a determinant of international competitiveness. So exchange rates are important. As I said, it's the subject matter of separate videos. Relative inflation. Some countries have very high rates of inflation relative to others, which means that dealing with those countries may be problematic. Or it could be that the domestic country, the country who wants to export, is facing higher rates of inflation. Inflation simply means a general rise in the price levels. All the prices in the country on average are rising by a certain percentage. And if that's high, that means costs will be high in that country, and therefore the country will experience problems in trying to sell overseas. Tax rates are important. Governments need to raise taxes to pay for the government commitments. Government commitments in terms of, let's say, the defence forces, law and order, the infrastructure of the country, pay for roads and rail and airports and so on. And also, governments redistribute money from one group of people to another. People who are less fortunate or less able to work receive some money to sustain them. So some countries may have very elaborate welfare systems and very elaborate plans for economic development. So the governments in those countries will need to raise a lot of tax. And if it taxes the businesses to pay for those ideas and for those programs, then of course the businesses will have less profits, will have less incentive to make the goods, will have less incentive to go through all of the issues of dealing with international competitors. In fact, the businesses may cease to exist. They may just give up and think, why should they continue to work hard to produce products if they're going to pay a lot of tax? So tax rates are clearly an issue. And different countries have different tax rates. And this is why we see companies moving to other countries. Constantly, companies are moving from one country to the next. They're looking at the advantages of being in different countries. And one of the advantages may be lower tax rates. Interest rates are also important. Interest rate is the amount that companies have to pay to borrow money. If a country has very high rates of interest, it's expensive for the company to borrow to perhaps cover short-term falls in revenue. Sometimes perhaps companies take on big orders. They have to invest a lot in raw materials, in labour time, and in perhaps new equipment to fulfill the order. But that would have a severe impact on the cash flow situation for the business. So it may have to borrow from the bank. And it has to borrow at a high rate of interest. That makes it less attractive. So interest rates in different countries are also an issue in determining international competitiveness. Now, these are some of the issues which help to determine international competitiveness. It's worth going back over these, making a note of them, and making your own short notes to explain why each of them is important. Now, increasing competitiveness. Well, firms can increase their international competitiveness by rationalizing output to get rid of high-cost plants. So companies sometimes look to the international situation, look to different countries to see what the costs are in different countries, and if the costs are a lot cheaper somewhere else, they may want to close some plants in one country and open some in a different country. There may also be opportunities for outsourcing, which means they arrange other companies in other countries to make some of the products, and perhaps part of the production process is completed elsewhere. So the companies are constantly looking at their cost base, and if their cost base is high, they have more incentive to look round, to look at other countries and see if they can rationalise their output and get rid of the high cost plants. We've seen over the years companies relocating to areas where labour costs are lower. This is one of the situations that it's difficult to deal with, because we want workers to work in safe environments, and we want workers to be well paid and have a good standard of life and so on. But that costs the companies a lot of money. So the companies, in their efforts to perhaps survive, or you may say in their efforts to make more profits, they may wish to relocate. So they move to a different country, causing unemployment in the domestic economy. So the more we try to look after workers in our country, the more incentive companies have of to move. And if the companies move, then the very workers we were trying to help will have no work at all. It's a tricky problem, and we could debate this issue for a long time, trying to find out what solutions and what policies could be implemented to try and deal with this. But it is a very complicated issue, and it's a very tricky issue to comprehend and deal with. Companies, of course, can increase their competitiveness by innovating the process. Innovating the process means perhaps introducing robotics or introducing better management processes, perhaps looking at just-in-time or some variant of just-in-time. It may look at quality procedures throughout the organisation, may look at stores management and so on. So process innovation could be a way of looking at international competitiveness and dealing with high amounts of international competition. Companies domestically have an incentive to constantly scrutinise their own processes to see if they can improve these and reduce costs. Of course, product innovation is very important. Customers expect products to change over time. It seems to be the case that the rate of product change is almost ever increasing. We expect more durability, more reliability. We expect better quality. We expect better designs and so on. So the onus is on the business to try and ensure that it's producing a product that's in demand and one that's popular in different countries, one that can be marketed successfully in different countries. Incorporating the latest technology into investment almost goes without saying. It would be ridiculous to make significant amounts of investment in a technology which is out of date. Companies will simply not do that. So investment should be up to date in terms of technology, and before investment decisions are made, companies really ought to investigate what's likely to happen in the near future in terms of technology in the context of the particular types of investment they're contemplating. They should also, of course, look to existing technology and see how it can be optimized within their production systems. The idea of sourcing from abroad has been around for a long time. We call it outsourcing and so on. Um, Sometimes various components may be bought in from overseas. It may be this is the product of cheaper labour costs in overseas countries, or it could simply be the case that companies overseas have the investment, the equipment, the expertise to make components and deliver these to other companies elsewhere in the world. So it's important that companies keep an eye out to see who's making what the quality is, what the reputation is, and also what the price is, of course, and to see if that will cut their unit costs. It's imperative that companies try to seek out new markets and look for new opportunities. This is the function of entrepreneurship that I mentioned earlier. It's important that the company looks to what it can produce and what it is producing and see where it can open new markets. This may be on a geographic basis in other countries, or it could be even domestically, looking at variations in its product line to see if it can supply new markets domestically. But of course, in so doing, it may be cutting off opportunities for international companies coming in. Because it has identified the markets and it's supplying the markets, and it's got a lead. It's got a lead on the rest. It's the prime mover. It's the first mover in that market, perhaps. So it will have an advantage. It's important that companies have good relationships with both the customer relations management, and with the suppliers of raw materials, suppliers of equipment, so that it can ensure that it can continue its production process, and it will enjoy an increasing and more reputable position in the market. So an increasing position in the market, it's getting perhaps more market share, more reputable. Customers see it as a good quality product, good reputation, sound company. So it's important that the company does this. If it does it domestically and is successful, it may be able to transfer some of that reputation and some of the status it enjoys domestically to international markets and gain an advantage in international markets. There are many examples of this. For example, popular brand names. The popular brand names could be let's say very important in America or in Europe, and they may be translated to other countries, perhaps in the Far East or in Africa or in other parts of the world. And customers in those parts of the world will know that this brand has a good reputation perhaps in Europe, in America, and so on, and that will do part of the marketing for that particular product. The marketing is in a sense done by the reputation of the product. Now, the government's role to improve international competitiveness. Well, governments seek policies which aim to encourage research and development spending, perhaps through tax breaks. So the government in its budget and in its taxation system may enable companies to engage in research and development and not pay tax on the amount they spend. So they make a profit and dedicate some of the profit to research and development, and that's not taxed. And in many countries that's the case because governments recognise the importance of research and development for the long-term prospects of the company and of the country. Of course, the governments try to improve the skill base of the country through the education system, the provision of good quality primary, secondary and tertiary education systems, turning out students at the end with appropriate skills, with various competencies and abilities and people who are engaged and understand the importance of industry and commerce and careers. And they are, this is being promoted by governments. Governments underpin the courses. They check the quality of the courses. They check that the students coming off the courses meet certain standards. And that, of course, improves international competitiveness. The government tries to also improve the economic infrastructure so that companies find it easier to work and trade internationally. So the infrastructure could be good transportation systems. This could be also international transportation systems, good airports with good facilities, cargo-based systems that can handle large amounts of imports and exports, and good port facilities and customs clearing and so on. So it has a good infrastructure aimed at promoting international competitiveness. The government also would want to promote competition between companies, because it's through competition that costs are reduced and companies try to maintain their position in the market by innovating, by having new products, by trying out new designs, and by trying to cut costs. So they try to promote competition between firms, and in so doing, of course, the successful firms out of this process of competition, they're better equipped to take on international competitors. The government also operates macroeconomic policies favourable to business expansion. Macroeconomic policies means the widespread government policies that include fiscal policy, taxation, government expenditure, monetary policy, looking after the interest rates and the supply of money, and also looking at areas like investment. Now, these are, broadly speaking, called macroeconomic policies or macroeconomic areas. And the government tries to promote business expansion by finding a combination of policies which will enable businesses to grow and to be developed and grow, and eventually to be able to expand and take on international competitors and move into international markets. An example of this could be trying to have a low interest rate, which we'll talk about. But a low interest rate will help companies to invest and borrow money. It could be that the macroeconomic policy is, as I said earlier, cutting taxes, not just for research and development spending, as in the first point we made here, but also cutting taxes, just generally cutting corporate taxes, so that companies have more incentive to set up and produce and try to expand into other markets, because they've got the resources available to enable them to do so. I've just mentioned reducing interest rates to stimulate investment. It's debatable whether a reduction in interest rates has much impact on investment. It could be consumer demand has a bigger impact. So ensuring that the customers have enough to spend on products may be more important than cutting the rate of interest. But having said that, there's still an argument to be made that interest rates are an influence on the level of investment and the rate of investment in the country. But generally speaking, it's debatable. Economists come down on two sides here. It could be that, as I said, customers' disposable income is more important in stimulating investment. I've already mentioned as well reduced tax rates to stimulate enterprise, effort and investment. By simply cutting taxes, as I said earlier, the companies will have more resources left. They'll have more of their profits left. Therefore, they have more incentive to produce. They are less likely to go bankrupt or go out of business because they have more reserves, and they are going to perhaps work harder to try and develop their business, to expand their business, and perhaps to move into international markets as well. The government also deregulates parts of the economy to try and promote competition. So areas which perhaps in the past were given special privileges by the government, almost monopoly positions, these are being changed. For example, transportation may be deregulated. In other words, private companies may set up and start competing with each other in areas which in the past they were not allowed to do so. But this would promote competition, and the idea is that competition leads to lower prices, more innovation, and better services for the customer. Of course, looking at the international situation, all of this means that the companies domestically who are now competing become more adept, more skillful at competition. They know exactly what's required, and the culture has changed. The culture has changed in the sense that now they know the importance of pleasing the customer, selling it at a good price. They know the importance of quality. And all of these skills means that the companies are equipped to take on international competition. The government also tries to reduce bureaucracy. Sometimes governments have a lot of regulations about setting up a business and where the business should be set up and the type of business, and it becomes very bureaucratic. And this may put off people from starting businesses. And therefore, of course, the country loses, because the only way customers can get the products is by importing them from competitors overseas, where perhaps there is less bureaucracy. So the onus is on the government to try and make it easier for entrepreneurs and business people to set up businesses, not to have obstacles, to reduce the obstacles to starting a business. The government may also try to encourage businesses to share ideas and best practice. There's a fine line here, of course. They don't want the companies to collaborate, perhaps form cartels or even form into monopolies. But having said all of that, sharing best practice may be done in a very general sense. We know, for example, that quality is important. Academics have a good history in putting forward what is best practice. They look at particular companies, they work out what the companies are doing right and what they're doing wrong, they write them up in academic papers, and we read them and we talk about them. So that means that companies also know what best practice is. They know the importance of quality, they know the importance of product innovation and process innovation, they know about just in time, they know about logistics and the importance of training. All of this, these good ideas, these are passed down through perhaps business meetings, chambers of commerce, institute of directors, but also may come through academic papers. Students do study business at college and at university. It's important to reduce protectionist barriers to stimulate competition. We don't have international competition unless we can get rid of the barriers to trade. Sometimes governments put up barriers to try and protect companies because they think their companies are not strong enough to compete internationally, so they put up tariff barriers against products from overseas. It may be counterproductive because then the other countries put up barriers against them, and eventually international trade is reduced. And this is why we've got the World Trade Organization, and this is why we constantly try to reduce barriers, to encourage trade, because we know that there are advantages from international trade. The law of comparative advantage, and which is dealt with in another video. But we know that these things are important. We know world trade brings greater prosperity and more products, more jobs, a better standard of living for the people in the country. So we don't want protectionist barriers. We don't want tariff barriers, taxes on imports. We don't want quantity limitations on imports. And this is why governments are constantly trying to reduce the amount of restrictions on imports. The government, of course, tries to encourage investment in human capital. After all, it's people who make products. It's people who work the machines. It's people who design the machines. It's people who design the products. So everything goes back to people. And it's important that the people are developed. Not only does the government have a good education system, or should have a good education system, at all levels, right through from the earliest ages, right through to whatever stage people drop off education, right through to doctorate level, master's level, whatever, diploma, degree, certificate, whatever, wherever people want to get off. But the important thing is that the importance of people is recognized by businesses and by the government, and that investment takes place in the people. It may be that companies simply offer training programs to their workers. They may have continuous programs of training. They may have promotion based on the achievement of certain assessments, which is based on their training programs. So people have an incentive to engage in the training program. But what we do know is that everything goes back to human beings. Without human beings, nothing happens. So the entrepreneurs are human, the managers in the companies are human, the customers are human, and it's important that companies develop their human capital so as to properly compete with companies overseas, who of course will be also developing their human capital. So, in this video we've talked about some of the important issues in globalization, and in particular looking at competitiveness and globalization. There are many points that we've gone across in the various slides, and it's well worthwhile going back, making your own notes and padding out your notes, making supplementary notes to explain each of the points, because these are issues that are important in understanding the overall pattern of international trade and why it is that some companies and some countries seem successful in particular areas, in some areas, and why other countries and other companies don't seem so successful. So it's important to understand this. But that's all we're going to deal with in this video, so let's leave it at that and say thank you for watching.